tesoros ajenos y muere de hambre después. Las entrañas de la tierra va el minero a revolver. Saca tesoros ajenos y muere de hambre después. Trabajo, quiero trabajo, porque esto no puede ser. En la noche del minero ya comienza a amanecer. Trabajo, quiero trabajo, porque esto no puede ser. En la noche del minero ya comienza a amanecer. A parcerito, ya comienza a amanecer. A parcerito, ya comienza a amanecer. Trabajo, quiero trabajo, porque esto no puede ser.
Well, welcome everybody. It's great for everyone to be here and join us today. We wanted to start with Atahualpa Yupanqui's Trabajo, Quiero Trabajo, thinking that was an appropriate song for our discussion today in our celebration of Doctora Angela Vergara's latest book. And she says, yes, I started an article with that song. So of course it had to be appropriate. Thanks for joining us. I'm Enrique Ochoa. I'm professor of Latin American Studies and History, and I've had the pleasure of being Angela's colleague for the past over a decade or so. This is a joint event put on by the History Department and the LAS program. We're doing this in conjunction, right? So I'll be, I guess to describe it a little bit, I'll be asking some initial questions, and then we have my colleague, estimadas colegas, Eileen Ford from History, and Erica Verba from Latin American Studies, who will be following up with different questions, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion. Does that sound all right with everyone? Great, and as you saw, right, it's being recorded. We're recording it to be later on to put on the History Department's YouTube site. So again, as I said, really it's a pleasure to be here to celebrate the work of our colleague and professor Angela Vergara. As most of you know, or maybe you don't know, right, Dr. Vergara, aside from being an accomplished teacher and professor at Cal State LA, is an internationally recognized scholar of Latin American labor and social history. She's published widely in journals and books in the US, in Chile, in Argentina, in Mexico, in Brazil, in England, in Spain, and in France. And later on, she'll tell me what I missed, because I'm sure I missed some, right? Angela is among really a handful of truly transnational scholars in the US, right? Everyone kind of pretends to be transnational in different ways, but in terms of being really tied into the literature in South America, in Chile, and then in South America and Latin America, in Europe and in Spain and other debates, as well as in the US, right? Very few people are. So really we're honored to be able to have her on our campus, although we're not at our campus yet. But we'll soon be back there. Angela is the author of Copper Workers, International Business and Domestic Politics in Cold War Chile, editor of Company Towns in the Americas, editor of a Radical History Review special issue on the other 9/11, Chile, 1973. Angela is also on the, right, she asked me not to say this, so I will. She's also on the board of editors of the American Historical Review, and she was just elected to the Executive Council of the Latin American Studies Association, which is the largest professional association in the world for people and for individuals and institutions engaged in the study of Latin America. As one student kind of recently told me when I was announcing this in class, Dr. Vergara is a powerhouse. She was outstanding professor in 2016. And so luckily, right, the campus has recognized what we all know is really the amazing work she does and what she brings to the campus. And so what I wanted to begin is by asking Dr. Vergara to tell us a little bit about fighting unemployment, right? What brought her to the project intellectually, but also personally. right? Because among the things, right, that's exciting about our work is the connection between the personal and the political. Doctora.
Well, thank you, Enrique, for that introduction. I think was too much. But thank you, everybody, for being here. I know it's the end of the semester, so it's hard to squeeze so many classes and assignment and attend on top of that a book talk. So this book, as I talked at the beginning in the introduction, it took me a long time to conceptualize and to bring it together. On the one hand, it's a book about unemployment, and it's a book about how people define unemployment and how those definitions have changed over time. I start thinking about the question of unemployment first many years ago when I was asked to write an article about the impact of the Great Depression on the mining industry. And that led me to the archives. And as I was looking for documents and reading more about the impact of the Great Depression, I was really impressed by the amount of documents and by the fact of all these welfare professionals, state labor unions, sort of describing the impact of the crisis, how this massive displacement of people trying to survive throughout the 1930s. So I would say the question really came first from looking at documents and trying to piece together this story about unemployment, what was happening in Chile in the 1930s. Second, it also came from my own readings. And I think when I was a grad student, I did a minor field in US labor history. And I fell in love with the Great Depression and the New Deal. It was my favorite topic in US labor history. So I always wanted to find that in Latin America, but I couldn't find it till I went to the archives. So it also comes from these readings, from looking at other places, what was the impact of the Great Depression, how it changed Social Security, how it changed labor rights and benefits. And in that way, I also somehow tried to find what was happening in similar or different ways in Chile. But I think every topic is personal. And I think in many ways it comes from our own experience. And as I was writing the epilogue of the book, and I was writing about the 1980s, I think it really came from witnessing, in many ways, one of the most severe economic crises in Chile in the 1980s, and seeing unemployment, and seeing the closure of factories, and seeing the end of the coal mining industry. And all these sort of experience that I saw that I never really reflected, when I wrote the book, they came back together. But along with that, I think it's also, as some of you may know, I'm the daughter of a social worker. And one of the things I really remember about going with my mom to community organizations and meeting when she had all her so-called cases, was the first question was always about work. Do you have work? How's work? Did you lose your job? What happened? And I think those experiences of seeing that is not only about this large economic crisis, but it's the everyday issue of having your job at risk, of being fired, of being laid off. And I think those, as I paste together, and I think that's part of what I try to do in the book, bringing together the historiography, the archives, but also the importance of people's experience of how they live through periods of crisis, but also in this long economic instability that Chile in the 20th century.
Great. Maybe if you can go on a little bit more and just talk about what are some of the central claims of the book, kind of what it is you argue, and some of the contributions that you see in the work.
I think the main contributions and the main argument of the book is that I would say that the experience of unemployment is shaped state policy, but is shaped in contradictory ways. In some sense, the state reacted to unemployment by exerting more control over working people and controlling people's mobility and establishing some benefits. But at the same time, because it came from the top, it came from the state, it came from welfare professionals, the question of unemployment also increased control and increases somehow an effort to regulate the labor market, but also to regulate benefits. So when we look at the work of medical doctors, lawyers, or social workers that work within the labor department, we see this effort to really place people into categories. So part of the story of the book is looking at how the state reacted, conceptualize and define unemployment, but also how that instead of extending benefits or building a more democratic society, what it did was really to exert new forms of control and to really try to classify people who deserve and did not deserve aid, on how they could really manage the crisis.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ford?
Hi. Thank you so much, Angela, Dr. Vergara, for writing this wonderful book. And I have a few questions. I hope the volume's okay. Someone will let me know if it's not. And so I'd just like to start off by saying what a beautiful book. Your methodology was especially impressive to me, and it clearly uses both a top-down and bottom-up approach to wonderful effect, really wonderful result. And so I particularly appreciated this approach that combines the local and the global and its methodological lenses. And so I was wondering, in terms of that, local and the global, what was the biggest challenge you faced in striking this balance in your research?
Thank you, Eileen. I think, well, first, in terms of the methodology, to try to summarize it, I try to emphasize, I think, three themes. I'm a very eclectic historian, so I mix methods. I'm not like a strict social scientist, I think. So for me, one part of the methodology is to really bring the stories and to really sort of tell what happened. And I think that's something I learned very early on in my career, is that history is about telling stories. And you have to narrate, and you have to explain and reconstruct what happened. And that's especially important when we do labor history and social history, when those stories are usually untold or usually forgotten and displaced. So part of the methodology, and maybe the book is full of stories, is really trying to bring those stories up and to tell what happened. Along with that, because I work a lot with state sources, or theses published by lawyers and social workers and medical doctors, they were really sources what you can say from the top. So I try to bring up that like all methodology of reading the sources against the grain to see where the stories are and to really find workers' voices, although they're not always there. But you have to try to find them and to try to read those terms many times to see what they really mean and where are workers in all that story. And third, as you said, there is this question of the global and the local, because I think an important transformation in the history of Chile and in the historiography has really been to connect Chilean history to what happened in other parts of the world. And not only in a sort of comparative history, but in more this transnational methodology to see that ideas, people, commodities, they all cross borders. And we need to account for that. So is bringing the local, bringing the global, and all of that. And I think the biggest challenge was to make sense of all of that in a short book. And I think really moving between global events that I'm not an expert on, so I'm not an expert in European history, although I could see the influence of the British social security system, I could see the French influence of how you bring that without getting into our national history. There's always a sort of temptation. So keeping a balance to see, to maintain the local, to be able to maintain the stories, but at the same time that they're not completely disconnected from larger national and global process. So I think that was the biggest challenge of keeping those two narratives in a way that will make sense, that at the same time you acknowledge the historiography, that you acknowledge this big process, but you're not losing sight that what is important is worker people's life and struggles. So when you talk about the global, it has to be in connection to those experiences.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the biggest accomplishments of the book, is that you are able to manage both of those stories in conversation with one another, which is really, really difficult to do. And I had one question. I was really particularly interested about the work on the 1920s. And so I was wondering if you think that there was sort of a missed opportunity in the 1920s for radical leftists and communists in relation to the ILO. And so, you know, you work a lot on the ILO, and I'm just wondering if this was a missed opportunity on the part of radicals, or is this a product of, you know, them not really being willing or able to engage with the capitalist system because, you know, for hegemonic reasons? That makes sense.
Yes, and I think the 1920s is a very fascinating part of the story. And at first I had left it out of the book, and I went back because, as you said, there's something during the 1920s when all these laws were discussed, and when the ILO became, and the International Labor Organization became this important international player, influencing not only European events, but also Latin America, when there was also this very intense labor struggle. So there is something in the 20s that they was trying to work, and they was trying to transform or even making this capitalist system a little bit more fair. But at the same time, I think in the context of Chilean history, and if you look at the labor history of the 1920s and what happened after, employers were extremely reactionary. And then even when the enforcement of the most basic labor laws, they contested that. They went to the court. They refused to enforce any labor law in the countryside. They refused to really transform labor relations. They put limits to legislation. They took funding out of the Labor Department. So even if there was a minute in which you could see these new laws and this new conversation taking place, both locally and internationally, the characteristic of employers and the characteristic of the national elite really limited any effort to really democratize Chilean society. So I think it's one thing that I struggle with, and especially with the 1920s, is that you have this very progressive legislation, and that some of the most famous Chilean labor lawyers will call it the most progressive legislation in Latin America, which I don't really think is true, but they like to say that. But in reality, how the law works, and I think that's one of the challenges, because we need to move from the text of the law to how the law is enforced, and how the law really reaches working families spread out in a very long country, and for many people very isolated from the center of power. So I don't know if it was a missed opportunity. I think it really demonstrates the tensions that will continue throughout Chilean history in the 20th century.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think, you know, in terms of the radical nature of some of the labor laws that were implemented, you make the excellent point that, you know, for example, domestic workers, women were excluded from even, you know, the legislation that was passed, as were most agricultural workers. And so I think, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, about women, domestic workers being excluded, or the sort of exclusion as part of the process of constructing those laws.
Yeah, and I think there are many parts, many ways in which women were excluded. They were, most of the jobs that we're doing, they would tend to be informal or outside the labor of what was defined as formal work in the 1920s and 1930s. So they became somehow outside the labor legislation. Then they would do work such as domestic workers, where the rights were really minimum. Like in the case of job security right, domestic workers could be fired if they have lost the trust of their employer. And that trust could mean anything in that domestic relationship. It could mean that that woman was accused of neglecting the child, of looking in a way that was threatening or anything like that, and they could be dismissed with any sort of compensation. Most domestic workers had not access also to the labor courts or to any of the officers of the labor department, because it means a big somehow move to go to work in a very isolated way to really reach the labor system. So women were excluded in those because of the type of work they did, because they work in more unprotected situations, but also because of the ideas and of how the state, the lead, and this big sector I call these experts, these welfare professionals, define work. And they usually saw work in the 30s and 40s as done by men. It was male that worked. And what women did was to supplement. They were always dependent. So when the crisis hit, the 1930s hit Chile, most of the public work that you can see is the first effort to give some sort of an emergency response to unemployment. It went to men. There were not emergency work for women. Unlike the US, that you can see there were differences in that. And women received assistance. So women were sent to a shelter, they received food, they deal with a social worker, they got some milk, some clothes, etc., but they did not get work because they didn't supposed to be working. But in reality, many of them did work. And when I went to the archives, there were so many letters of women that most of the time they tried to, because women learn how to work the system. So they will say, well, I had a husband, but he left and I don't know where he is. And he has not sent us money. Therefore, I need assistance. But you could see the sort of lack of protection for women workers because they were always considered part of a family, although many times that family did not really exist as professional conceived.
Thank you. And so I think the next question I wanted to ask is about the nitrate industry. And, you know, for all of the people in the audience who really look at Latin America as a whole, I think that Chile offers, the nitrate industry offers a perfect tragic example, right, of the consequences that many Latin American countries faced when they were forced or persuaded to focus on industries for an export economy. And you know, the examples abound, right, in other countries. And so I'm just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about how this transpired, how it developed the nitrate industry in Chile, which then becomes so important to the story later in the book, the collapse?
So yes, so as you said, the nitrate industry is the most classic case of an export commodity in this late 19th century, early 20th century Latin American country, owned by British businessmen, isolated from the rest of the country. It basically means this huge migration from the Central Valley and the south of the country to work in the north. And many labor historians have considered not only the birthplace of Chilean labor movement, but also this process of wage labor. The first time that many workers were exposed to a wage relationship. And they had no other ways to survive than work, because you couldn't really grow anything in the Atacama Desert. But the nitrate industry is also interesting because for experts in the 1920s and 1930s, it was the birthplace of Chile unemployment. So when some of the intellectuals started writing about unemployment in the 1920s, they saw it as a consequence of the export industry. They went back to nitrate because it was the place where they could see this huge level of unemployment, this massive displacement, and also the place where they needed to intervene. Because once unemployment hit the nitrate fields, you had to move people out. You couldn't leave them there. Nobody could really survive there. So it led also to organize the transportation of workers. It also led to move people around. And at the same time, because there was the fear that nitrate workers were really radicalized, it was crossed by this effort to how you control and how you supervise this huge migration that was coming back to the Central Valley or to the south. So the nitrate then, it provides this space where you can see how, for the first time, policymakers start talking about unemployment and they start seeing we really have a crisis. For the most radical ones, it also became an opportunity to say, see what the nitrate industry is doing to our country. We need to regulate. we need to really industrialize. And that it became a sort of one of the responses to unemployment from some of the intellectuals was to really prevent another unemployment crisis. Chile needs to industrialize and need to provide jobs that could be stable. So it is really an important part of the story of how Chile negotiate with its dependency to the export. It also how the elite fear these nitrate fields as a cause of social and political instability, and how nitrate workers also brought down to the city or to the south, their own organizing experience or their own experience with unemployment.
Thank you. And just, I wanted to comment too, I think that the mobility and migration part of your work is so fascinating as well. And I have one final question before I pass it on to Dr. Erika Verba, but the question is sort of methodological and for all the students in the audience, you know, we often talk about you can only write the book that the sources, for the sources that exist, right? And as you've already said, you kind of talk about reading against the grain, reading between the lines, right? But is there a dream document that you wish you could have had access to, you know, or a type of document that really would have appealed to your story?
Well, I have many dreams that I keep looking for when I was doing the research and I couldn't find it. I think I would have loved to know more about what it means to be unemployed in the 1930s from a worker's perspective, and also from the families of what it really means to live through these decades of political, social, and economic instability. In many ways, I'm always jealous of US history because they have all those oral history that they did in the 1930s and 1940s, and we can really understand many times what happened to different groups in different parts of the country. We don't have that to Chile because nobody wanted to record anything at the time, and they dismissed the stories. So if I wanted dream source, would have been that. I wanted the records of the 1930s. I wanted people to speak. And the only thing I had the reports, and I have to read them against the grain to try to find what they really mean. I have some sources from labor unions and political leaders and all of that, and those are important too because they give you some sort of balance and help you to somehow like navigate these other documents, but the sort of more rich social history to really be able to understand those feelings and those experiences and decisions, I would have really be happy with that. I think also many of my stories are chopped because you get one document and what I was always trapped is like, I want to know what happened to people, you know, and they disappear from the archives. They're mentioned once, twice, but you never know what happened next. So be able to know what happened, where they moved, what they did, how many kids they have. I think that would be the dream for a social historian.
Right. Yeah, where the trail goes cold, right, is really always frustrating. And I think, again, the human part of the story is always really, really exciting. And, you know, just to sort of understand what someone's going through is really an important part of every story. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over now to Erika, Dr. Erika Verba from Latin American Studies. Thank you, Dr. Vergara.
Oh, so thank you for being here, for writing this book. I think for me, I want to just say what I think about the book first, and then I'll ask my questions. But I think it's, for me, it's like this model of why social history is important. And I think I think a lot of us that have been reading this book or are thinking about this, it really has a very present day resonance. And we had a discussion with that where Ángela, as she's writing it during a pandemic and finishing it, you really, and where unemployment or numbers are historically high, you really kind of connected to her work in a very real way. In fact, as we were trying to choose what song to open with, my suggestion, which I think Enrique's is better, but the line that my suggestion starts, it's a poem by Nicolás Guillen. It says, "Me matan si no trabajo, y si trabajo me matan, siempre me matan," right? They kill me if I don't work, and if I work, they kill me. They're always killing me. And I think that and what I love about the social history part of it, or what I think is so exciting, and I think can be carried outside of sort of be used by all of us, no matter what our specialization is this idea we take something like unemployment. We have been hearing about unemployment all year, right? We have numbers, we get reports. And your book says, who decides what unemployment is, right? And you watch and there's no obvious answer. The answer is historic. And you go and you figure out, how did people define unemployment? And how do workers, which I think is really powerful, how do workers say, no, that's not unemployment, we're unemployment, and this is what we need? How do they try to, not always successfully, we see, but how do they try to at least have some say in what does unemployment mean and what do we need as workers? And I think that's a really, it's sort of peels back the layers of how things work in ways that we could also be thinking about that's very relevant to us. So thank you for that. I think it's very exciting. My questions are all kind of geared towards the research project. First of all, I don't like you anymore, Ángela, because her book starts by saying she thought she could write it faster. And I've been working on a book for 3 decades. So I'm not, you know, I don't know, but I'm actually, so out of sheer envy, I want to know more about how you do it. And one of my questions to you is, I do like you still, but I want to know what's your secret. So one of my questions would be kind of just starting from the small and then moving out. Can you talk to us about one of these sources that you really were, that spoke to you, that told you a story that you realized was bigger than just the page you're holding? So tell us about one of those, please.
Yeah, so as I was thinking about that question, because she told me before about the source that speak to me, it's a document that I found very late. And it's a document that I love. It's a court document, although it was published in a legal review. And I like it for two reasons. One is because I found it in LA, in that wonderful library that is the Law County Library. It's in downtown, just on First Street, across the metro station. So if you're in LA, go there, because it's a wonderful and a very democratic and open space. But the document that I like is a case that is that involved someone that was called a vagrant, and that person is only called by his nickname, that is Gallina Muerta, the dead chicken. And this person, who is in his 30s, was defined as illiterate. He was arrested and condemned to a few months in prison because he was a vagrant. However, the case was appealed. And when it went to the second court, the judge said, you cannot accuse him of being vagrant because this person is disabled. He's mentally impaired. It's called un enajenado. And he's also physically disabled. So he cannot work. A society who needs to take care of him, although he doesn't really explain who should take care of him, who in society in this country in the 1930s would actually take care of him or provide for him. What I like about the case, and it somehow brings back what Erika says at the beginning, is who defines unemployment, who defines work and not work in society, who's able and not able to work, and how we navigate those definitions. And especially in a case that implies that if you're accused of vagrant, you will go to prison. But if you're not, you will receive some sort of protection or benefits, even in the most minimum way. So the question of categories is something I struggle throughout the book, but it really, that case helped me to see that the ways in which society will label you, where you deserve or do not deserve aid, whether you are a deserving poor or you are undeserving poor, whether you're a woman or a man, where you're disabled or not, and who defines that? It really defines at the end what kind of benefits you will get and what is your position, what are your rights in society. So that case, that is a very short case, and I think I bring at the very end of the book, was really important for me because it clarified how those concepts still matter. I liked also the case because it's actually the 1940 case, and we tend to think about vagrancy as a 19th century stuff, and then we forget about it. But the question of vagrancy, the fear of vagrancy, continues, and we can see it in LA today. It continues in multiple ways, shaping people's rights and access to rights and the ability to really participate in society. So I think that was one of my favorite documents in some way.
All right. But another question, and it's one that I've come up with since we had our discussion, but and maybe it's a selfish question too, but how do you know? What I love about your book is the way it is, as Professor Ford talked about, how it weaves in the local and the global, and you really do a fantastic job sort of discussing how, because they were transnational discussions, you know, how people were looking at this, how they thought they could solve it. My question to you is, at one point you have to say, that's outside of my book. That's really important, and I have to kind of understand it, but I'm not going to write about that. How did you, can you think of an example of that? How did you put boundaries around it? Because your book is very, very complete. But at some point you must have had to say, this, basta, this is what I'm going to write about, but I'm not going to look at that. You know, stay away from me.
Yeah, I think that's a choice that every writer faces when you write a book. I have to say that I'm a minimalist writer. So I really work into having the most simple and most concise argument to make as clear as possible. So for some reason, leaving things out is a rational choice for me. It's not a hard. It's not, I'm not tempted to write a 3 volumes history of unemployment. But I do think that as I make those choices and I make it, you really have to keep into what you really want to do and what you really want to demonstrate, and how important it is to mention everything. For me, sometimes mentioning too many stuff is just a pretentious way to say that you really did a lot and learned a lot, and then you want to put everything in your book. So for me, somehow it's like to keep it straight, keep the story clear and what it matters. What I left out, for instance, and I had to make, maybe that was a more practical choice, I left out the economic story. And that is a very controversial one, maybe when you study unemployment, but I want to write a social history of unemployment. And I want to look at those categories. And because I'm skeptical of numbers, I didn't think that the numbers matter that much. What it matters at the end was people's experience and how people talk about that. So I left out the economic part. I left out also, I would say, really trying more comparative, because I was tempted to bring all the countries and talking and go back and forth Latin American different nations. But at some point I brought the Argentinian case at the very beginning because I thought was very influential, but keeping in mind what it really matters. And I think in that sense, you really have, I don't know, is what kind of book you want to write. And I want to write a short book. And I want to make it accessible, and I want to make sure that it makes sense for people. So in that sense, I thought that I didn't have a hard time. It's like, in a special way, I could like podar a libro in some ways, and somehow it makes sense.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And I'm going to have to hire you as my editor and a writing coach. And then I guess my last question, because I know we want to have time for everyone, would be, what is there like a piece that's hanging out that is your next project? Is this steering you? Do you know what's going to happen next? Is there a birth of a new project within this project?
You know, I've been on sabbatical this semester, so I keep going back and forth many projects, but also I'm locked in my house without access to libraries or archives, so it's been hard. At first, I thought I could leave labor history, and I thought I was ready to take a turn, go to something different, study the history of science, and I was ready to do that. But when I finished the book, I can't. I think I really love labor history, and I think it's important. So I keep debating topics. Part of me wants to enter the period of dictatorship, and to really do a social history of dictatorship, not a political one, but a social one focusing on working people. So there is that. There is part of me that wants to study social security, like somehow going benefit by benefit. So I did unemployment, now I got to social security, and mostly to retirement funds because they're so controversial. And also because tends to be a myth in Chile that somehow retirement funds were great before. And when I read the sources, they were not great. People didn't really get pensions. So I wanted to look at the older history of retirement. So I'm still debating because I can't really travel right now, but I think I will stay in this social labor history. I don't think I can really live it.
All right. Well, we don't want you to, if you keep on writing books like this. Well, I would love to now, or we would love to now, myself and our co-hosts, we'd love to open the floor to discussion. And I think the best way to do this, for those who aren't familiar, if you go to if you go to reactions, that's where you get to raise your hand. So on the bottom of your screen, there's a place that says reactions. And if you press on that, you'll have the option of raising your hand. And I'm happy to call. And we have Enrique has raised his hand. You go for it, Enrique.
No, I was modeling, that's all.
Oh, he was modeling. Yeah, you already got to ask questions. Let's find some other people that want to ask questions or comment. Don't be shy. This is a great crowd, Angela. You have a lot of people that want to hear about your work, so that's wonderful. Okay, Troy has a question. Dr. Chatterjee.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. It was a wonderful book presentation and 3 wonderful co-hosts. Congratulations, Angela. The sad thing is I haven't read the book. I ordered a copy. I still haven't got it, so I'm super frustrated. And so I can't really ask questions from the book. But Angela, you and I have talked about environmental history, especially the history of agriculture. And I was just wondering what happened to that project, because you sent me a terrific proposal. And I was wondering if you're still going to work on that. Is that part of labor? So that's question 1. And my question 2 is, so you're talking about labor in terms of wage labor, compensation, unemployment, right? So I'm talking about another kind of labor in the 19th century where workers defined themselves in terms of their skill, their ability to labor, and the kinds of skills that they had. Has, the E.P. Thompson notion or the Richard Sewell's idea about labor, has that completely gone by the period that you're focusing on, where labor defines you as an individual, the kinds of labor that you engage in as a source of identity?
Thank you, Choi. We can talk about the environmental part. I haven't abandoned it. I think I can do everything. I'm a stubborn, so I think I can do and write everything. In terms of labor identity, and in terms of skills, I think the Chilean case is different. I mean, there are some groups that really have a skill, more middle-class groups. I think there's also, and this part of the story of the book, the experience of white-collar employees. And I think although they don't have a manual skills, they thought themselves as having these intellectual skills where they work for the state or they work for a private company. They saw themselves as respectable workers, and that defined their identities. And for them, when the Great Depression hit, they really felt that they were losing their ability to maintain their social status and to continue to do not only the work, but to continue to be what they had traditionally been. So you can see that sense of identity in some ways and the sort of skills, especially on this very small group of people, but they struggle to maintain those benefits, and they will lobby the state to get housing rights and other compensation rights to maintain a lifestyle that will be connected in some ways to their kind of work. But also, I think we tend to dismiss the skills or the identity of everyday laborer And I think they do have a strong identity. And and when the Great Depression hit, even if they don't talk themselves about a specific kind of work they did, they talk about unemployment, or when they wrote letters, or when they petitions, they talk about unemployment as somehow a loss of a way of life. And their inability to continue to do that kind of work. So it doesn't matter what kind of work it was many times. If it was mining, it would be different kind of mining, but the inability to work and to have that kind of, not just for the money, but the sort of experience, the relationship, it was very basic. And you can see it throughout the entire period. It's not a sort of a 19th century skill as artisans or like things like that, but it's a different kind of identity, and it's a working class identity rather than their ability to work either in the factory or in any other places to earn a wage, to be independent. And when there are more testimonies, especially for the 1980s, that there is some collection for our interviews, and I think I use some in the book in the introduction and the epilogue. Many of the people who lost their job, they talk about that loss of space, and a space where things made sense, where they could talk to their co-workers, where they negotiate rights, where they live, where they talk and have political demands, etc. So I think it is a different kind of identity, but is central. And the experience of unemployment, when it can be massive unemployment, but could also be the unfair firing, that someone just fired for no reason. It really hurt people in a sense of how they saw themselves and their place of society, in their family and in their community.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Oh, there we have Jerry Cisneros.
Hi, Dr. Vergara. I'm looking forward to getting a copy of your book. What perked my interest was this discussion of using letters of women in the domestic workers cases. I thought it was intriguing to use that evidence. I assume there's probably court case histories, or maybe those are attached to those that you've used. What I wanted to relate that to, or wanted you to discuss, was I also heard about the migration piece. And I assume that was some sort of rural to urban in-migration. I don't think the mining centers would have done that, but you tell me. And what I was wondering about is what evidence you had of that in terms of voices. You talk about this bottoms up look, and that intrigued me. So what is your evidence base that you're using for the migration piece?
Thank you, Jerry. It's so nice seeing you here. So there's many questions, so let me try to unpack them. The question of migration. What I talk in the book is mostly the fact that in the 1930s, when the depression hit, especially the north of Chile, people could not really live or survive there anymore. So they start migrating back. It's almost as a return migration. But although authorities try to manage that migration and try to control these people that were displaced and making sure that they were distributed evenly throughout the country, people followed their own migration routes, as they had always done. So they moved to the countryside, they would tell, and they negotiate, for instance, they negotiate tickets. That is one of the most important benefits that you can have in a crisis, is that you get a railroad ticket to travel. First, a steamship ticket, and then a railroad ticket to travel to your destination. And most of the documentation will say that people say, oh, I have family over there. Just give me a ticket. They arrive there and they have really never have family. They were following a job or a lead or anything like that. So it's a migration that is caused by the crisis, as people were trying to find jobs, trying to survive, trying to follow routes. What I think is interesting is that it continues. Chilean people, though it's never really talked too much about it, they continues traveling. They go to the south because they have a job for a few months, they go up north, they go to the port, and although it's not a migration, it's sometimes seasonal. they can spend a few years until they can establish themselves, or they get a job that is better. So migration is part of working class life in Chile, this internal migration. Your second question about domestic workers and women. I didn't explore that so much in details, but I had a few court cases that I found that they really talk about, there were mostly cases that women presented to the court in which they talk about how they had been fired for no reason or how they had not been paid. There were many cases because the domestic relationship is very complicated. So sometimes there were family relations. I had a case, for instance, in which a woman said, I was never paid, and although I worked there. And then the employer said, but I was her uncle. I'm related to that woman. We brought her to live in our house. We raised her, but we are family, so she shouldn't have been paid. And the woman said, no, I supposed to have been paid. I work every day, I took care of the kids, I clean, I did everything, and I was never paid. So there are questions in which there was not a labor relations, but sometimes it was a labor relations. And that's part of the complicated thing, especially with domestic workers. In terms of your question against the grain and reading the document, is mostly sometimes in finding the evidence. For instance, I work a lot with theses that were written by social workers in the 1930s. And they tend to be very top-down. They have a wonderful collection of data. They describe things and all that, but they may use label. That person is lazy, that person doesn't take care of the kids. And they use this sort of social stigma. So when you read against the grain, it means that you don't believe the social stigma. You don't believe this concept. You understand that they were produced by a person who believed that. And you try to use the data to understand how those concepts were produced. So that's part of the method. It does make sense? Yeah.
Charlie, you have a question, Charlie Novato?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Let me lower my hand. Okay. I just wanted to say, first, congrats to Dr. Vergara on the book. I'm glad I was able to be here as well. And a question that I had for you, Professor, is that what were the forms, or do you cover this in the book? What were the forms of organizing at the time, right? Or forms of organizations that had emerged at the time? What were some of the actions, demands? And I say this because during this time in the 30s, right? For example, in the US, from what I've studied, briefly, if we look, for example, at the Communist Party at the time, they were pushing forth to demand worker wages. You had unemployment councils that were being formed. So what type of organizations, I guess, were at that time, and especially during this time in Latin America too, because there was also the uprisings happening in Brazil, El Salvador, all during the early 30s. So I just kind of wanted to ask about that.
Thank you, Charlie. It's nice seeing you here too. So yes, and you're completely right, and you have studied those movements too. So I know that you really know. There were different forms of organizing. As you said, there were unemployment councils. There were also a lot of organizing happening within the shelters. The shelters were emergency lodging that were established by the state, where they house unemployed people and their families. There was organizing also from labor unions, especially in a large workplace, that they tried to negotiate layoff, or they tried to negotiate housing rights. For instance, in the coal mining, when they shut down the mines, or they shut down from 5 to 3 days of work, many of the unions start negotiating, okay, we can keep housing, or we should keep food, or we should keep certain benefits. So there was efforts to really negotiate some sort of compensation, or some sort of right, or some sort of salary, even in condition of unemployment. There was also large political organizing, although I did not get into that in the book. That was one, going back to Erica's question, that's also one of the things I left out, because it would have become a whole political history of the 1930s. But there was all of these activities going on, shelters, I would say, There was also a lot of small activities, and sometimes they were unrecorded. So in emergency work programs, people really organized because they were so exploited, paid below the minimum salary. Sometimes they were not even paid, they were only given food. A lot of people resisted those conditions, and they organized, not necessarily in a large movement, but they just protested. So it's an active time. And then in the second part of the book, when I went into the 30s and 40s and 50s, you can also continue to see how labor unions fought for unemployment compensations. And one of the biggest demands of the labor movement was to change the contract law to make sure that they could gain some sort of job security. So political and union organizing continue beyond the 1930s into trying to make work more stable, into trying to limit this arbitrary firing. And it took many decades because what's called the work stability law was only enforced in the 1960s. So before that, the big majority of people could be fired only with a 1 week notice or a payment equivalent to 6 days. So that's nothing. So the fight for job security, the union fight for job security is something that continues, I would say, from the 20s all the way into the 60s.
I guess I'll jump in. Congratulations, Angela, on your book. I'm really excited to read it. And I think Charlie kind of swooped in with sort of a framing of the question that I had. And I'm thinking from the perspective, not just as a Latin Americanist who's not trained in this time period or Chile, but also as an instructor of world history. And so your book reminds me of a kind of an older documentary. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's a series called The People's Century. It came out of PBS. And one of the volumes is on the 1930s, and it highlights Chile. It actually highlights Chile in the crisis of the 1930s, the nitrate workers. It does a little bit of a job contextualizing it within a global context of what's happening in the US and United Kingdom and Belgium and Sweden. And what I was really kind of interested in hearing you speak to, if this is, part of the framing of your work, was the terms by which, ultimately the unemployment is being made. So part of it you're saying is housing, some of it's contract law. I'm really kind of curious the ways in which Chileans are framing what it's actually kind of a global process of people demanding more security in their labor, right? In a time period where governments are essentially saying like, sorry, we're going to have to just allow the economy to work itself out. So I was interested not just in how workers are organizing on the ground, but then ultimately how are governments, how are lawmakers, how are they crafting at all new legislation by which unemployment is going to be provided? Is it just job protection? Is it minimum wages? I mean, what ultimately are some of the kind of milestones or kind of hallmarks of the unemployment fight across the decades?
Thank you. That's a big question, but I haven't seen that documentary. But I think the several parts of the story. One is we do see, especially where the source I work with, that is the International Labour Organization. We do see from sort of this international scene an effort to regulate work, and that means in terms of unemployment, one is. There are three elements. One is to really facilitate and regulate how people find work, and to eliminate, especially in what today we call the Global South, all those for-profit placement service. So one response coming from the top and coming from international organization was to regulate how the market worked by creating a public placement office. So that was a very common response and something that dated back to the early 20th century, but became also important in the 1920s and 1930s. 1930s. Second, there was the question that you really had to regulate dismissal. That people could not just be fired, not even during economic crisis. There need to be certain rules that work and that you compensate. And that became a demand beyond economic crisis. And I think it's a demand that comes especially from labor unions in different places and in different countries. And that is a demand to regulate dismissal, to establish things like seniority, to regulate some form of compensation, and to be able to file cases in labor courts or instances to really, in case you were fired in arbitrary way. So that is a demand that it comes sometimes from government and global institutions like the ILO, but it's really something that also is articulated from the labor movement in different places depending their legislation to really understand the labor contract and to really make sure to enforce protection. And third is the demand of Social Security. And I think it's very clear by the 1930s of understanding of bringing unemployment as one of the risks or the social risks that needs to be compensated. And it's something that comes early in Europe, in Western Europe, although with different experiences where it was union funded or whether it was funded by local government or was funded by the state, is something that found a lot of resistance in the US and Canada, and is something that was completely dismissed in the case of Latin America. Latin American countries did not include unemployment as a benefit in the Social Security system. They would go for healthcare as the most kind of like important benefit that they will give. They will give some retirement fund, but the question of unemployment as a social benefit within the Social Security sort of architectural building, it took a long time. It will, in some countries, there will be some sort of early retirement benefits in Brazil and Mexico, but it was not something that could be included, although it was a demand, and you could see it throughout different labor movement, and even the ILO conference where workers were represented and they participate in the debate, that the question of including unemployment risk as part of Social Security was very central, was a very important demand, but something that the state, and either they will argue economic reasons, and employers and elite will argue social reasons, saying that workers were not ready for this kind of benefit, is something that was very common across the continent.
Very good. We have another hand up. Sorry, I was on mute the last time. Cesar Amparo, are you there? Very good.
Yeah. Sorry, I came a little late and I'm driving, but I really wanted to be here, so I wanted to ask a question about the effect that did the state use any fear mongering, such as like fears of communism, like they did in the U.S., to kind of put a halt to the formation of protection for workers in Chile?
Sorry, yeah. Yes, and hi Cesar, thank you for making the time to come to stop by. Yes, the state used fear, and the lead used fear to oppose legislation, to limit rights, to limit migration. One of the things that I will see through the documents in the 1930s is this permanent letters from local officers and elite owners, and especially landowners, saying, well, the nitrate workers coming here that can be radicalized, they will cause trouble, they are bringing those ideas, they don't really want to work, they're just coming to organize. So there was a lot of fear, and something that continues throughout the entire period. So I think in many ways, some of the, especially some of the social benefits like distribution of food or shelters, many times were organized and put in place in reaction to or to limit that sort of activism. So they really play with fears. There is a case of a special shelter that was built in the port in Valparaiso when the first unemployed people start arriving in the port, they stay in some sort of an anarchist house, they said, and they were housed there. And that became, for the police, according to the police, some sort of this radical hub that was gonna create all this instability in the port. So they decide to open a shelter where they can put a police officer on the door, where they could control food and control who came in and out as a way to really control people. So benefits played that. We give something in order to control.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't see any more hands up. I know we're getting close to the end, and I know that Professor Ford is going to take us on out. But I don't want to. I don't want to. It's hard to see everyone at once. So if you do have a question, now's the time. All right. I think I'll hand it over back to Eileen. Oh, Gabriela. Okay, sorry, Professor Frida.
No, I'll be brief. I don't have a question because I haven't been able to read the book. And you actually, Erica Verba, stole my question, which was, the wonderful question you made about the connection between the material that Dr. Vergara worked on and the present moment of, scare of unemployment. So I just wanted to congratulate you on this work, and I to reiterate that I'm looking forward to reading it and maybe engage you in conversation about this. And I love your idea about the dictatorship. I'm not, no pressure or anything.
If I've understood correctly, we already have 2 books that you're writing next. One is on, Dr. Chatterjee has asked for the one on agrarian labor, and we also want on the dictatorship. So I hope you have a great sabbatical. No. Eileen, it's why don't you? I don't know if you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah, I've been assigned the task of the wrap up here, and so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Vergara, for writing this fabulous book. Really an inspiration to all of us who work with you. I mean, we all know how hard it is to juggle being an outstanding professor that you are with also doing all this research. It's mind blowing, and like Erica said, I don't think that you actually sleep, but we're all so proud of you and so happy to have you at Cal State. And thank you so much to everybody who came to the event, and thank you to the history department and to the Latin American Studies program. Really excellent work being done. And thank you so much, Angela, for presenting your work and sharing everything with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and all your very kind work and support. As I said in the acknowledgement, I would have never been able to write this book without everybody's support. And I think that is, I want to say the support from colleagues, friends, family, students, from student workers, and for everybody who works on campus and made possible and support me to write this book. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.